I was raised at a time when kids were speaking up and standing up, but we also had the encouragement and the example of my parents. We're coming from a time in our country where we have these democratic ideals of equality and justice, but of course we didn't have them when our country started, and that's what I like to talk with students about, that we had these ideas, but we weren't there. We're coming from a time when we had slavery, and we had slaves that were building the White House and building the Capitol in Washington, D.C., where I live. But we also had the wonderful sense of justice that our people have had, and the wisdom and the brilliance of our forefathers to build it right into our democracy, that we can change this because we have a Bill of Rights and we have a First Amendment. The rights of teachers and the rights of students go together. So when students don't have rights, as it turns out, it's a time when teachers don't always have their best rights either. And here's one from 1858 where a boy out of school, and he yelled at his teacher, he said, "Oh, Jack Seaver!" For that, he was whipped with rawhide the next day. Well, this case, strangely enough, was cited in a recent Supreme Court case called Morris v. Frederick, which was the infamous bong hits for Jesus case. I don't know if you've heard about this, but some kids put up a sign at their school in Juneau, Alaska. Well, not just a sign, an 18-foot-long banner saying bong hits for Jesus. The boy, Joseph Frederick, he didn't even really know what it meant. But he said that he was testing his First Amendment rights. I actually talked to him on the phone. And he said, yes, he was okay, so in that case recently, he lost, by the way, Joseph Frederick. The Supreme Court ruled that he did not have a right to put up a sign saying bong hits for Jesus because he was advocating illegal drug use. And the idea was that the schools had the say, the administration had the say over what was expressed in school, if it was reasonable or not. And this boy, Earl Worcester, in 1915 in California, he decided that the auditorium in his school, he said that if the school cared so much about the health of students, they should put in more fire exits in the auditorium. For that, he was punished, and it went to court, and he lost. Because the court, again, said that it was reasonable what the school was saying, that they should be able to limit the speech of students. Oh yeah, here's a good one. The lipstick case, 1923, Pearl Pugsley, right here in Arkansas. Who knows about Pearl? Have you ever heard of her? Yeah, you heard of her? She wanted to wear her lipstick, right? Yeah, the school made a ruling against makeup. And she said, that's not fair. I can imagine this happening today, can't you?
Yeah, that's what I
But now it'd probably be like blue hair and, piercings and things like this, like I see it with the kids in school. Okay, so Pearl spoke up and stood up about that, and her father backed her up, and he said that that wasn't fair. And so Pearl pursued this case. Even after her father died, she said that she was doing it in honor of her father. She actually lost. Because again, they said that this was reasonable, that the school was doing this. But the school did change their lipstick policy, so I guess you could say in a way that she won. Then we come up to the very important Gobitis case, 1940, when the Supreme Court, now we're getting into the Supreme Court's rulings more, that ruled that students do have to salute the flag in public school. These kids were named the Gobitis children, and it was during war. They were Jehovah's Witnesses. And the students and the religious leaders there said that it was against their religion to salute an image like a flag. And they had photos of children giving the salute that reminded them too much of Hitler, first of all. And they said, this is a time when fascism is on the rise, and in our religion we don't believe this, and that we should have a right to. Well, the Supreme Court ruled against them and said, no, we're at war. Children must salute the flag to show their patriotism. As a result, a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses were attacked and chased out of town and beaten, and their homes were burned. And it was a very violent period for Jehovah's Witnesses until something happened 3 years later, which is a very unusual thing for the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled to reverse their decision. In the famous Barnett case, which said that students do not have to salute the flag, as a matter of fact, in our country, that this is part of our democracy. And Robert H. Jackson, he's so amazing. I just came from his hometown in Jamestown, New York. He wrote this beautiful decision. He was one of the most eloquent justices. This would be a great one for your students to study. I'm sure they already do, but his decision was so beautifully written because he said that in our constellation of democracy, there is no more important star than the idea that no official can tell you how to think or what to say when it comes to politics, religion, or matters of opinion. And the fact that schools are educating children for democracy makes it a very important place for the constitutional rights of children to be respected. And he specifically talked about the First Amendment. It was the first time in the court's rulings that the idea that children have First Amendment rights was brought up. In the 1950s, when so many kids were speaking up and standing up, as children have all through history. I mean, I love to tell kids about, 100 years ago, there were these children who were speaking up and standing up against, the conditions in the factories. People like Harriet Hansen, who started the Factory Girls Association, and, the first factory workers were children. Children have helped to build our country. Kids have worked in the factories, the mines, fought in every war, worked in plantations and farms. So I love telling kids those stories about kids all through history who have spoken up for democracy and made things better. But when I was growing up in the 1950s, there was so much going. Well, first of all, we had the Brown decision. But right around that time also, there was a huge explosion of another kind. It was out in the Bikini Atoll Islands, where Truman did a test of the H-bomb. And a group called the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which is the oldest peace group in the world, got very concerned about that. 1958. I was just growing up, and my parents became part of that. They were concerned about it as well. The year before, my dad, who was a Methodist minister, had been put out of his church in a small town in Atlantic, Iowa. See, I'm a Midwesterner too. I grew up in Iowa, then I lived in Missouri for many, many years. Well, that year, I was only 5 years old then, but 1957, the same year as the Little Rock Nine. At our neighborhood swimming pool, black kids were not allowed to go swimming, just like what you were talking about, Jan. And so my dad didn't think that was very Christianly. And he went up and complained about that, and some of the kids from the school went and complained too, from the church, complained too. When you speak up and stand up for what you believe in, are you always going to be popular? Not exactly. But my father did it anyway, and as a result, he was kicked out of town, basically. He lost his church, we lost our house, and we had to move because the people at the city hall said, well, that's the way we've always done things, and of course, kids always hate that answer. So then we moved off to a new town, Des Moines, Iowa, where my parents, again, kept speaking up and standing up for what they believed in, their Christian ideals. The idea of equality and brotherhood and love. The things we learned in church when we sang songs like, Jesus is pure, Jesus is... I know some of you have heard that song, right? That's how I was raised, that love and brotherhood. Because really, it's all about love. Even the First Amendment is about love. It's about how we treat each other in our democracy and the respect we have for each other. And that's the way I was raised. 1958, right after my dad was put out of that church in Atlantic and we moved to Des Moines, well, there was a huge march for nuclear disarmament in London. And they needed some kind of design. So there was a young man named Gerald Holcomb. He was a designer, and he made this design that stood for nuclear disarmament. It was the flag signals for the naval ships. The flag going up like this would be disarmament, and the one down like this would be nuclear. So nuclear disarmament. And he made his design, what was it? The peace sign, 1958. And he took it to the leaders of the march who were organizing this march over in London. He said, here, I've got this design. They said, I don't know. I don't know if that's going to really go over. It's okay, but, I don't really know. Maybe we could... He said, no, give it a try. Let's just try it. So they made these big lollipop signs with the peace sign on it. And you can see the photos of them marching in London. It was just amazing. Life magazine took those photos and it came over to the U.S. and the peace sign exploded in the early 1960s. But that wasn't all that was exploding, because I was going to school in that time when they were doing nuclear testing, and there was a lot of talk about radioactive materials being in our milk. Maybe you've heard of strontium-90. When I was growing up, we weren't thinking about ISIS so much and hearing all those fears. We were hearing about strontium-90 and how it might be in your milk. But drink your milk, it's okay. But you might get a little strontium-90, it's okay. And then, to prepare for nuclear war, here's what you have to understand: why kids sometimes wonder about the adults. Here's how we were supposed to prepare for nuclear war. Maybe some of you did this also. Okay, kids, nuclear war alert. Hide under your desk. Quick, come on, get under your desk. Nuclear war. Do you remember this, anybody? Did it make you wonder if the adults really had a handle on what was going on? Because my parents, they were part of the social gospel movement. They believed that we should bring the heavenly ways to earth. The ways that Jesus, believed. Like, peace, brotherhood. We should make this on earth. And so they believed in brotherhood, and my mom joined the NAACP, and my dad was inviting the black kids in town to come to church and everything, and that didn't make him too popular. In 1963, not only was there the March on Washington, a very big year for our country, it was a very big year for our family, when his church decided that, really you're not a good fit here either. So my dad lost his next church, and we had to move again. 1964 was also the year of the Birmingham Children's Crusade. Martin Luther King was down in Birmingham trying to he was writing his letter from Birmingham jail, and he was trying to get the kids of the adults of Birmingham to stand up against segregation, against the Ku Klux Klan, for democracy. But they were scared. They were scared of lynchings. They were afraid that their houses could be burned. The kids said, we will stand up, we will speak up. Because kids are courageous, and kids have wonderful imagination and creativity. And the thing about kids, too, is that kids love to take action. And so these kids took action, and they got up there, and they came marching out of the 16th Street Baptist Church singing, this little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, all these great songs. And the police put police dogs on them, German shepherds that ripped their clothes. You know these stories. These pictures went viral all over the world. Oh, the greatest democracy! And here's how it's treating its little children who dare to speak up for what's right, for democracy. I was just turning 10 years old that year, and I thought those children were so amazing, but I knew I wasn't like that. I knew I had to go roller skating and study for my math class, my favorite class. And I was a very good student, and I like to have slumber parties and things. I knew I wasn't going to get out there and face these fire hoses and things, but I thought those kids were really amazing when I saw them on TV up in Iowa where we were living. The next year was Freedom Summer. Here's some kids in Mississippi, again, standing up and speaking up, as kids have done all through history, for democracy and for a better way. And that year, 1964, the summer, we just passed the 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer. There were about 3 or 4% of African Americans registered to vote in Mississippi that year. So some young people had a very daring idea. They were part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and I know all of you probably know it. Who's heard about this? Freedom Summer. Yeah, it's the 50th anniversary. It was huge. They trained in Oxford, Ohio at the Western College for Women, where I just was a couple of weeks ago. I was there to celebrate their 50th anniversary. And as soon as they went to Mississippi, 3 of the young people were murdered by the Ku Klux Klan. Their names were Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman. James Cheney had a little brother who was about 12 years old, the same age as me that year. And I heard about all of this, and we were very sad. And that year, a call went out all over the country for people to come to Mississippi, especially the faith community. Because they had this idea, and Martin Luther King had this idea also, that if the faith community would get more involved, that this would help to protect people in the South who were speaking up for justice. And so there was a call that went out to all the faith community. Please come to Mississippi this year and help us and witness, bear witness to what these young people are doing. I was just turning 12 years old that year when they went off to Mississippi. I stayed with my friends, Edna Taylor and her kids, and learned to play croquet. I had a great time while they were up in Mississippi, risking their lives, because when they were there, well, they tried to go to the White Methodist Church, and my mother was immediately identified as someone that was helping with the voter registration drive. So this big burly guy at the church just picked her up and put her outside. And she said, "But that's my God too. I want to worship my God." He said, "No, it's not. Not here, honey. You better just go on back to the north, wherever you came from." Well, she was from South Texas. He didn't know who he was messing around with, because she kept speaking up. But in the end, my dad talked some sense into her and said, "Come on, honey, we better get out of here. We're going to get killed here." So they left, and they went over to the black church, where they were welcomed. And they were sleeping at night, with this older black lady who had, been involved with the voting rights campaign there. And she said, "Now tonight when you go to sleep, you sleep in the back so that when the shooting starts, you'll be safe back there." And they went to the back, but they were very upset and worried. And in the middle of the night, they heard the shots ring out. And so they ran up to the front, where the lady was standing by her window, this older black lady, looking out in the night, the dark night in rural Mississippi. Ruralville, actually, it was called. And my parents said, "Quick, let's call the sheriff. We've got to call the sheriff." Okay, what did she say? And all of you who've heard this story, don't say. What did they say? What did she say?
That was the sheriff.
That is the sheriff. She said, "We can't do that. That is the sheriff." The sheriff was out shooting at her because she dared to take part in democracy, to try to register to vote. She dared to have the white preacher come down and help. And for that, she was being shot at by the sheriff, who was with the Ku Klux Klan. That's the kind of collusion that we're coming from. That's the kind of times that we're coming from. But some students that year spoke up and stood up. They wore buttons to school. It said, "One man, one vote." They were in high school in Philadelphia, Mississippi. It was a black high school, and they were suspended for doing that. But a court case started that year, 1964, that would later be cited in the Tinker decision. And by the way, when those students, when their bodies were found, their murdered and tortured bodies were found August 4th, the same day as the Gulf of Tonkin episode, when the naval ship claimed that it had been attacked by the North Vietnamese. So the next year, 1965, now on TV, we saw war. The Vietnam War, because the Gulf of Tonkin resolution had been passed almost unanimously by the U.S. Congress, and LBJ was escalating the war. So kids from our neighborhood were being drafted, and as my little sister Hope and I would cook dinner, because that was our job. Every day we were supposed to cook dinner because my mom worked. As we were cooking dinner, we would watch TV, and what would we see on TV? The burning huts of children in war, the body bags on the ground. And there was a newscaster named Walter Cronkite. And every night on the news, he would say, "The body count today in Vietnam is 8. Today there were 8 soldiers killed in Vietnam." Next day, 10 soldiers today were killed in Vietnam. The body count is 10. And it just went on all the time. Well, my brother and his friends, Chris Eckhart, they had an idea. They decided, maybe if we just wear black armbands to school, this will mean that we're sad. This will be our symbol. because this was a symbol that went all the way through history of mourning the dead. And that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to mourn the dead. And that year, it was Christmas time also, 1965. My father would read to us from the Bible the story of Christmas, the promise of forgiveness, the promise of Jesus' birth, the promise of love. And then on TV, what do we see? War. The adults didn't have forgiveness. The adults didn't seem to be loving. They were at war. They were fighting. And we wanted to do something about it. We wanted to speak up about that, as young people have all through history. And so they said, come on, Beth, you can do it. We're going to wear these black armbands. I thought, oh, that's what they called me, Beth. And I thought, I don't know about all that. That's good for you guys to do. That's good. But I was thinking, I'm kind of shy. I was one of the youngest children in the family. I was very shy. And I had to do what? Go roller skating, yes, and study for my math class. But in the end, I decided I would try. I would try to be brave like all these other people. Well, the principals heard about the plan and made a rule against armbands 2 days before we were going to wear our armbands. So then I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to break the rules. I was a good student, but yet I thought we should, speak up and stand up. Like all these other kids I had seen, like the kids in Birmingham. And so in the end, I decided I would wear an armband to school, and I would take the consequences, and I would be suspended if that's what it would mean. And so I went to school. I was really nervous, and I had my armband, and I went to get my friend Connie because I always picked her up on the way. And then I got there, and I saw my math teacher, Mr. Moberly. Oh no, he was waiting at the door of math class. He had already warned us. The whole class, he took the whole class the day before to warn us that if anybody dared to wear an armband to school, they'd be suspended. And he talked all about the war, and actually that didn't really help the school board's case too much later, because they said that if anybody disrupted the school, it was Mr. Moberly by talking about this so much. So there he was waiting at the door of the math class with a pink slip in his hand. And I was really scared and nervous, and I saw him standing there, and I went up to the door of math class. I had on my armband. I was going to try to be, brave and strong. And I took the pass from Mr. Moberly, and I walked down to the office. And Mrs. Tarman there said, now take off that armband. This is against the rules, Mary Beth. I'm surprised at you. So in a great stand of courage and conviction, I looked around the room, and I looked at Mrs. Tarman, and I said, okay, Mrs. Tarman, here you go. Isn't that funny? And ever since then, everyone's been saying, you're so brave. You're so strong, Mary Beth. And I didn't have that much courage. I had this much courage. I had a tiny bit of courage. But as I found out later, a little bit of courage can go a long way. It can make a big difference. Because Mrs. Tarman said, well, you're still going to be suspended anyway. And so I went home. I was really nervous, and I didn't know what my parents were going to say exactly, but I was able to convince my dad. Yeah, because I said, look, Dad, look how you stand up for what you believe in. Yeah. And he had to agree that it was our conscience. Because the next day, my brother John was suspended, and that day, a boy named Chris Eckhart was suspended, and 2 other kids were suspended. It would have been the end of the whole thing, maybe, except for a group called the ACLU. The American Civil Liberties Union. They heard about the case, and they thought the kids should have rights too. And so they offered a lawyer to my parents. But they said, first you have to go to the school board and try to change their mind. So that's me. Oh yeah, by now I had my little flip. See, that's probably why the news media always wanted to talk to me. That's what I figured. It was that flip. And then there's my mother and my brave father behind us, who decided to stand with us once he decided that it was our conscience. Because these people also had been through World War II and World War I, and they believed that if good people of conscience do not speak up, that's when you get Hitler. That's when you have Nazism. And they believed very strongly that your conscience is important. And in court, they asked him, they grilled him and said, well, what, you think you just get to stand up for your conscience anytime, any place you feel like? And he said, well, I didn't know that the conscience had a limitation on where you can feel it, where you can experience it. And I had to cry when I saw those words that my father said in court when I was reading it recently. He was was such a strong, good man, because he got so much hate directed towards him for some reason. That's where all the haters decided to direct their venom. And there's some other kids that were suspended, Chris Singer and Ross Peterson. But that's Chris Eckhart and his parents. He wore an armband also to school and was suspended, and his parents were with him there. He became the other plaintiff besides my brother John and I. And that's John and I at the Supreme Court. I mean, at the time of the appeals decision. We lost at the district level. Well, first the school board voted against us, although 2 people voted for us. It was a split decision. And so then the ACLU took it to court, and we lost at the district level, and we lost at the appeals level. This is around the appeals level time. I mean, you really have to, be amazed that these kids, like my brother, was going to be drafted in a year or 2 after this, and Chris Eckhart, and sent off to war to die. But they were being told by the appeals court that they could not wear a little black piece of cloth on their arm saying that they didn't like this war very much. That's the rights of children. That's why this case is a human rights case. It's a case having to do with the rights of young people and the rights of children.